So today we're going to talk about Chapter 7, the human population. And you probably already have some good perspective after watching the NOVA video that we watched in class, World in the Balance. And it had focused on some countries such as the US and China, India, and Japan. And so the opening story is about the environmental implications of China's growing population. 1.3 billion people were in China as of 2012 when your textbook was published. That's 20% of the world's population. And so it's the world's most populous nation. It's soon expected to become the world's largest economy, which the US is, and may soon surpass US as the top consumer of resources and greatest producer of pollutants. And that you saw in the video. So if the US population is about between 300 and 320 million, a number you need to know for the AP exam, surely 1.3 billion uh, citizens is going to surpass US in terms of consumerism. They had a runaway growing population that was growing exponentially, and all populations initially grow exponentially when there's unlimited resources. But as you saw in the video, they knew things were getting out of control. And since the 70s, China has had a one-child policy. So couples that do only have a single child get rewarded, and those that have three or more children, and probably two or more children, I think, um, are taxed more, their salaries are reduced, and education is extremely expensive. So China is one of the only few countries where government-mandated population control measures have significantly reduced the population growth. So now they only have a fertility rate of 1.6 births per children, and that's a great deal difference from between 3 and 6 per children. So if they keep going at this rate, they will finally start to decline in population by 2040. But notice that with all the manufacturing of goods that they've started to do, 16 of the top 20 polluted cities are in China. Between 1985 and 2002, population grew by 30%, but the number of vehicles on the road increased by 500%. So whereas coal used to be the biggest contributor to their smog, um, tailpipes from automobiles are now a major, major issue in China. So that moves us on to chapter 7. Every 5 days, the human population grows by 1 million people. 1.8 million people are born and 800,000 people die. It's not always grown at this rate. And until only a few hundred years ago, the human population was relatively stable, meaning deaths and births occurred in roughly equal numbers. But about 400 years ago, agriculture changed, sanitation began to improve. So when you have better living conditions, you have better sanitation, death rates are going to fall, but birth rates are still going to be high. And so that was the beginning 400 years ago, at the beginning of the agricultural revolution, that rapid population growth started to occur. So, as I just mentioned a second ago, in chapter 6, you saw that under ideal conditions, that all populations are going to grow exponentially. And the limiting factor could be a lack of food or water, nutrients, sunlight, an increase in predators, an increase in parasites, disease. Okay, limiting factors are going to determine the carrying capacity of a habitat. So why do I say that? Because we really don't know what the Earth's carrying capacity is, but we hypothesize that we have not reached it yet because more and more people are being added to the Earth every day. um, and yet the earth, we still have enough food. So, Thomas Malthus was a scientist who said in the late 1700s that while the human population was growing exponentially, at which it was, the food supply was growing linearly. So eventually we would run out of food, as you see in that top picture. So in the beginning, there would be a food surplus for people, but as exponential growth kept increasing, and as you see there with the food deficit right here, and that would have been due to the food growing linearly. And a lot of people did not agree with him, saying that no, that as humans have evolved and our technology has gotten better, our innovation has gotten better, our intelligence has gotten better, that we have always been able to keep up in food supply with the population. This next two slides is not in your textbook, but Paul Ehrlich is a professor at Stanford, and in the late 60s, he and his wife, who she's not credited here, but he and his wife wrote a book called The Population Bomb, and it was a really dramatic warning of mass starvation of humans in the 70s and 80s, which would come, since this book was written in 68, that starvation would come due to overpopulation as well as other societal upheavals, and were advocating for limits to population growth. And so he was kind of considered this new Malthusian after Thomas Malthus. And he was quite dramatic about it, and a lot of people didn't agree with his drama. But was he necessarily wrong? You know, in the late 60s, we were only at, I think, 3.5 billion people, only in the 60s. And he was saying that when he was born in the 20s or 30s, that there was only 2.3 billion people. And now look at where we are today in 2013, and we already have, in 40 years' time, doubled in population. So, one thing he had said, the opening line in his book was, "The battle to feed all of humanity is over. In the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now. At this late date, nothing can prevent a substantial increase in the world death rate." So, in answer to the question, what needs to be done, he wrote, "We must rapidly bring the world population under control, reducing the growth rate to zero or making it negative. Conscious regulation of human numbers must be achieved. Simultaneously, we must, at least temporarily, greatly increase our food production." And we have been able to do that. And we'll get into discussions about agriculture when we talk about the food revolution, especially with GMOs, genetically modified organisms. We are able to produce better varieties of foods that would withstand certain pests or pesticides or droughts, etc., so that we could increase food production. But was he necessarily wrong when he said we must bring the world population under control, reducing it to zero or making it negative? And we'll see that a couple of countries have already done that. And is it a moral issue or one of necessity that China implemented the one child policy? So, some food for thought there. All right. So, what are some factors that drive human population growth? Well, demographers are those who study human population and population trends. And so, that's part of when, you're asked your age or your race and ethnicity, is so people can get an idea of, what kinds of people are taking this class, or what kinds of people are getting this scholarship, or what kinds of people are living in this area. And some of those factors that are going to drive changes in human population are birth rates, death rates, migration rates, um, life expectancy, age structure, and changes in population size itself. Immigration is the movement of people into a country, emigration out of a country. So the net migration rate, as you can see in this graphic here, is the difference between immigration and emigration in a given year per thousand people. And don't worry, because we're going to actually next week work on several math problems without the use of a calculator on these kinds of changes in population, because you will have questions on the AP exam and you will have questions on my exam without use of a calculator. The crude birth rate is the number of births per thousand individuals, and the crude death rate is the number of deaths per thousand individuals per year. So in order to get a global population growth rate, we take the crude birth rate, divide it by the crude death rate, and divide it by 10. We divide it by 10 because even though we know that these are the number of births and deaths per thousand people, you still have to divide by 100 to get a percentage. So this actually takes one step out by just dividing by 10. If you are looking for a national population growth rate, so of a country, you take the crude birth rate and immigration, subtract the death rate and immigration, and then divide by 10. And finally, you can calculate the doubling time by taking 70, using the rule of 70, and taking 70 divided by the growth rate, that percentage, to get the time in years for it to double. Or you could use the rule of 70 to calculate the growth rate if you were given the doubling time. So here's an example. Worldwide in 2009, there were 20 births and 8 deaths for every 1,000 people. So 20 minus 8 equals 12. Okay, so there was a net growth of 12 people. Divided by 10 gives you 1.2%. So that's saying that the population globally grew by 1.2%, which sounds very low, but imagine adding 1,000,000 people every day. Another example, if you had a country, so this problem was global population, this is a country or national population change. 50 births, 40 deaths, 0 coming in, but 6 going out. You plug it into the formula, inputs minus outputs divided by 10, and in this country, you got 0.4%. So it did not grow very much. And when you're talking about population dynamics, the lower the number, the better. Again, doubling time. So here's two examples. What is the doubling time for a country growing at 3% per year? So 70 divided by the rate, or 70 divided by 3 equals 23.33 years. Or conversely, what is the growth rate of a country with a doubling time of 10 years? So 70 divided by 10, the doubling time, equals 7%. So just keep that in mind, that when you do have to answer those questions, when they ask what is the doubling time, it's years or seconds or months, but usually in our population studies, well, in human population studies, it would be years. And then growth rates are in percents. The next factor that's going to influence population growth or decline is fertility. The total fertility rate is an estimate of the average number of children that each woman in a population will bear. It is not counted per thousand people like crude birth rates or crude death rates. It's just a measure of births per woman. And that will change from country to country. So typically in developed countries, women will bear fewer children, and in developing countries, women will have more children. In the US, just a few years ago, and it's still very close or the exact same, the total fertility rate of the US was 2.1. So women were having just over 2 children. Demographers are also looking at replacement level fertility, and this is the TFR required to offset the average number of deaths in a population and for the current population size to remain stable. So typically, replacement is 2 in order to replace the parents in a population. However, this number though also depends on pre-reproductive mortality, which is how many people will die before they have children. So they take that number into account too, which normally will depend on the economic status of the country, and which will normally be that developing countries um, have a higher replacement level fertility. So when the TFR is equal to replacement level and immigration and emigration are equal, a country's population is going to be stable. If you have a country that has a TFR, total fertility rate, of less than 2.1 children, and no net increase from immigration is likely to experience a population decrease because that TFR is below replacement level fertility. You can see here, and that last bullet, replacement is 2.1 in developed countries and higher in developing countries due to higher mortality rates of younger people. And that's one of the reasons why women are having more children, because more die. So they need to have more babies. Um, in terms of this textbook, and I'm not quite sure if it counts as the UN definition, but at least in terms of this textbook, a developed country is a country that has relatively high levels of industrialization and income, and a developing country is one with low levels of industrialization and an income of less than $3 per person per day. We don't call them third world countries anymore. They are called developing countries or less developed countries. In one assignment that you're going to do, A Tale of Two Countries, the developing countries were renamed less developed countries. Life expectancy is another indication of population growth, and that's just the average number of years that an infant born in a particular year in a particular country can be expected to live, given the current average lifespan and death rate of that country. So you see there with the dark greens, they're expected to live long into life, and if they're yellow, they have a relatively short lifespan. Notice that the US average is 78 years for an average lifespan, and which is getting older, and the global average is 68 years. It was actually quite higher than it used to be, but due to improvements again in sanitation and medicine, water quality, which is part of sanitation, life expectancy rates have definitely increased. As far as that US average, that's taking into account males and females. 75 years is the in 2008 this is 75 years was the average lifespan for a male, 81 years for a woman, and that is typical, men having a shorter life expectancy, historically because they had greater dangers in the workplace. They were the ones who went off to war. They made more hazardous lifestyle choices because back in the day there were more men who smoked and drank and etc. But over time, since more and more women have entered the workforce and the armed forces, um, the life expectancy gap between 75 years for men and 81 for women is probably going to decrease, and in not that long of a time frame. Infant mortality rate is one characteristic that many demographers look at between developed and developing countries. And the definition of that is the number of deaths of children under the age of 1 per 1,000 live births. So notice they don't take account stillbirths. Child mortality rate is the number of deaths of children under 5 per 1,000 births. And you can see there in the US, we have a rate of 6.6 per 1,000 births. Places in Africa have 100 per 1,000 births. That's 10% of all babies born that die before the age of 1. That's a really high number. And globally, it's 49 per 1,000 births. Let me go back 1 second there. Keep in mind also, and I'm talking about the US here, that that's an overall average of 6.6 per thousand births, but it does also change between races. So the infant mortality rate for African Americans is actually 13.6 per thousand, 8.1 per thousand for Native Americans, and 5.8 for Caucasians. It doesn't look like there's a different number, at least in your text, for Hispanic or Mexican heritage, but they might have also combined those with Caucasian if they took into account at all. And then also keep in mind that it also depends on the socioeconomic status of the family or the mother, which will change their access to nutrition and healthcare. All right. Um, so even if you have a high life expectancy and a low infant mortality rate, a country can still have a high crude death rate because it has a large number of older individuals. Okay, so the U.S., for example, we have a higher standard of living than Mexico, which typically or historically has had a higher life expectancy and lower infant mortality rate. But at the same time, the US has a much higher crude death rate at 8 deaths per 1,000 people, and Mexico only has 5 deaths per 1,000 people. The reason is because the US has a much larger elderly population, with 13% of the population senior citizens, which is 65 or older, and only 6% of the population in Mexico is over the age of 65. So aging definitely has a factor when you're talking about crude death rates. Next, you have disease, and it is an important regulator of human population. And if you go back, sorry, pretty far, apparently, disease, if you see there the Black Death, caused a dip in the human population. Not that we're saying it was a good thing, but it probably slowed down that exponential growth for at least several years before it could recover again when millions were killed. So, infectious diseases, and those are diseases that are caused by microbes that can, oops, sorry, that can be carried from person to person, is the second biggest killer worldwide after heart disease. Between 1990 and 2007, AIDS related illness killed 22 million adults and kids, mostly in sub Saharan Africa. Life expectancy in Lesotho, which is one of the poorest nations in Africa, has dropped from 63 years in 1995 to only 40 years old in 2009. That's really sad, and that has come from AIDS. We'll talk much more about diseases and toxicity when we get to chapter 17, because you'll actually have a project where you research these kinds of infectious and non-infectious diseases. All right, then we get to age structure, and that's when we're talking about population pyramids. And these are the pyramids that show visually the age structure between males and females in a country. When you see a population growing after birth control policies, such as China that has their one child policy, or if they had voluntary birth reductions, uh, the population is going to keep growing. So that's called population momentum. Keep in mind that even if you went from um, a growth rate, of 3.6% down to 0.5%, it's still going to take years and years for that population to stop growing because you still have all of those people that are in their reproductive years, and women have many years of reproductive years. So here are population pyramids, and you are going to be doing labs where you're looking at these pictures. So a typical developing country will have a population pyramid as the top left. So it's a broad base. So many young people, children pre-reproductive age, and then many people in the reproductive age, and very small numbers of people in post-reproductive age or in old age. Sometimes the population pyramids will be, as you see on the bottom of these, they're in millions. Other times they're in percentages. But the position of the graph, the format of the graph will stay the same. If you see a stabilizing country, such as the United States, it will have more of a boxy look near the bottom and still declining numbers as you get older, of course, but there are still many more people at the older ages. Letter C, which is showing Germany, is a developed country where you see population declining. And that is because people are having fewer than their replacement. So they're maybe only having one child instead of two to replace both parents, or they may be deciding not to have any children. And that's causing this big bulge in the middle there, as you see with 40-year-olds, 40 to 50-year-olds, and smaller numbers. And that doesn't usually happen. Well, these people here in their 20s and 30s are deciding not to have children. And D, you have China, and I'm not sure as of what year, but I'm thinking it is from 2012. And you can see where um, their population control measures have been put into effect with that one child policy. So now fewer people, as you see in their, if I can get the mouse, 20s and 30s, are not having children. So, several slides ago, I mentioned the net migration rate, which was the difference between immigration and immigration, or moving in and out in a given year per thousand people. So, if you have a positive net migration rate, that means that more immigrants are coming in than going out. And negative net migration means that there are more people going out than coming in. As an example, about 1 million people will come into the US each year and only a small number of people are leaving. So if you start with, let's say, a population of 300 million, then that equals to about 3.3 immigrants per thousand people. And that does not take into account illegal immigrants. In this problem, which is on Do the Math on page 187, it wants you to calculate um, what the new, I'm sorry, how many people will they gain in another year as a result of immigration. So if New Zealand has a population of 4.3 million, a total fertility rate of 2.1, and a net migration rate of 2 per 1,000, so if that's a positive number, that means that more people are coming in. How many people will New Zealand gain next year as a result? If everything stays the same, when will population double? So there's actually two math problems in here. The first one on this slide. So to count the net migration, you take the number of immigrants, which is 2, divided by the number of total people in the population. So when you cross multiply, you get 8,600 people per year. So that means that 8,600 people are added to the population each year just by migration. TFR, by the way, of 2.1 means that it's at replacement level, and so that population is stable. In order to calculate that rate, you take the number of people per year that were added and divide it by the population to get your rate. And then to calculate the doubling time, you just use the rule of 70. So you take 70 and divide it by the 0.2% to get 350 years, meaning on migration alone, the population would double in 350 years. All right, so this is an important area, the demographic transition. And what this says, this theory, is that as a country moves from a subsistence, I can never say that right, a subsistence economy, so when they're just basically taking care of themselves, to industrialization, oh my gosh, to industrialization and increased affluence, it will undergo a predictable shift in population growth. And they have seen this in the case of the US and other developed countries. So I'll be going back and forth between the slide and the next. So in phase one, you have slow population growth because you have high birth rates and high death rates. So any country that is before industrialization will be in phase one. Phase one, high birth rates and high death rates. I'm trying to zoom out. Did I just say that? Any country before industrialization will be in phase one. Phase two is when you start to have a very rapid population growth because birth rates are still high, but death rates will start to decline because they have better sanitation, they have better drinking water, they have increased access to food, and increased access to health care. So, uh, countries like India, like China, in phase two. How do you like that? So, high birth rates in phase two, but declining death rates. And you can see that in that graph there. In phase three, you have stable population growth because you have industrialization. Okay, your economy is growing, your educational system is improving, people will start to have fewer children. Okay, so the birth rate comes down and the death rate also comes down. So phase three, birth rates come down, death rates come down even more. So this is most developed countries. This is where the US is right now, and most Western civilizations, Western European countries, Australia, etc. So phase four is going to be declining population growth because once that country has reached high level of affluence or wealth and economic development, women start to have better education, have better jobs, and so they start to delay having children or don't have any children at all. So declining populations are representative of Japan, Germany, and Italy. So you'll see here in phase four, I'm trying to zoom again. In phase four, oh, oops. Okay. In phase four, uh, low birth rates and low death rates. And you'll see right there that they're becoming equal. So their population is starting to decline. And then notice that the death rate is actually just climbing over the birth rates to indicate a declining population. So it's really important that you know the four phases and what types of countries or even specific examples of the demographic transition. Family planning is the regulation of the number or spacing of offspring through the use of birth control. This was something we saw in the video World in the Balance, where, well, in China it was basically forced family planning. And in India, they were going with selective abortions if they knew it was going to be a girl, so they didn't have to have so many children. But now, as women are becoming a little bit more empowered and educated, um, they are taking control of their body and using birth control. So you can see there with the total fertility rate in Ethiopia, if they don't have any education, a woman will have just over 6 children, and with an education of at least high school, they will only have 2 children. And it's been um, clearly shown that education is really the key for women to reduce how many children they're going to have. Next is just showing you the 12 most populous countries in the world, China being number one, India being number two, and the US being number three. But notice that only 3 of the 12 most populous countries are considered developed. Of Earth's 6 point, oh, well, this is in this book, 6.8 billion, but now we're over 7 billion as of March of 2012. Out of the 7 billion, over 5.5 billion live in developing countries, and only 1.5 billion live in developed countries. So populations that are in developing parts have continued to go rapidly at 1.5% per year. And conversely, in the developed world, they're averaging a growth rate of 0.2% per year. So it's very clear that poor countries, developing countries, are growing at a much more rapid pace than affluent countries, and that will continue to do so until they can reduce their total fertility rate or the number of children they have. This graphic is just showing you the relationship between economic development and the population growth rate. So, population growth in developed countries has mostly ceased or is leveling out at least and starting to decline. And developing countries is slowing, but growth is still going to be expected until at least 2050, as you see there. So they expect the human population to reach 9 billion by 2050. They expect it to reach 8 billion between 2025 and 2030. Now, keep in mind that we reached 7 billion just in 2012. So to go another billion is only going to take 12 to 17 years. That's an incredible amount of people when you think that a million people are added every single day. And that's taking into account how many people are dying. Ecological footprint, we talked about this at the very beginning of the year. A country with great affluence has a lot of wealth, like money, goods, or property. So most Western European countries, Australia, Canada, the US. So because we're so affluent, we tend to use more resources. So notice there the global average footprint is 2.7 hectares per person. So the average person in the US uses 9 hectares per person. So basically, we have 5 times the impact of someone in China and 18 times that of a person in Haiti. Almost done. The IPAD equation is an equation that is used to estimate the impact of human lifestyles on the earth. Now, this looks mathematical, but it's really just conceptual of the 3 factors that will influence an environmental impact. So the population, how much money they have, and the technology available. These 2 pictures here, there was a series of posters that this photographer did where they got a family in many different countries, developed and developing, and had them take all of their possessions outside of their house and put them outside and then photograph them in front of. So you can clearly tell that the picture on the left is in a developing country and that on the right is a developed country. So population, of course, is going to have an impact on the environment. Um, if everything else in their lifestyle is equal, 2 people are going to consume twice as much as one person. So if you have a country that has twice as many people as another country, it's going to use twice as much stuff. Obviously, if a person or if a country has a lot of affluence, then they're going to be using more resources because the more money they have, the more money they're going to spend and the more resources they're going to use. So, for example, in the US, we use the most energy in the world, and we're only the third most populous country. And then technology, um, well, technology can either degrade the environment or create solutions to improve the environment, which is what, engineering is all about these days, is trying to solve a problem. But technology can definitely impact your environmental impact. As far as impacts go, um, in your neighborhood, if we're cutting down trees for agriculture, we're taking away from the soil, so we're degrading the soil. That leads to water pollution. Also, burning of fossil fuels can affect your local area. Globally, the consumption of fossil fuels, which US is so horrible with, including importing all of the oil that we do. So imagine all of those barrels of oil coming from the Middle East and being shipped over here. So being shipped across an ocean, that takes energy as well. And then from all the use of this fossil fuel consumption comes an increase in greenhouse gases released. Urban areas, we'll actually be studying a whole chapter about urbanization. 75% of people live in developed countries live near an urban area or in an urban area, which means you're going to have more trash, more solid waste, more pollution, more CO2 emissions from cars. This does include, so it doesn't have to be an affluent country. This also includes the slums and shanty towns that you would find in India that have little access to sanitation, that don't have clean water, that have more diseases because if they go untreated and they're so packed together, it's easily transmissible. This just shows you a percentage of people living in urban areas. So it has grown. And this shows you the 20 largest urban areas in the world. So it's not just one city, it's kind of like the areas surrounding it. So notice that the area of New York City to Newark, New Jersey houses about 19 million people, but New York City proper is about 9 million people. Although that it might be different now. It might be more like 10 or 11. Tokyo, Japan is the most populous city in the world. The surrounding areas, though, make it 35 million. The city itself is still 26 million. So San Antonio, with a population, between 1.75 million and maybe under 2 million, imagine 13 San Antonios in the size of one San Antonio. It's crazy. I couldn't even imagine going to Tokyo. It was hard enough walking the streets of New York. There's just people everywhere. The impact of affluence, the gross domestic product is the value in products of services produced in a year in that country. So if you have a high GDP, that means that you're going to have a lot of spending, that you're going to have a lot of exports. And so usually if it's a higher GDP, you're going to be using more resources, so you have higher pollution levels. Rising income generally will correlate with falling birth rates. So we already know that as a country becomes more industrialized, and especially when education gets better all around, but more importantly for women, birth rates will fall, death rates will fall, and then population size will start to be reduced. All right, so that's at 43 minutes. That's chapter 7. If you have questions, let me know. Thanks.